He had half the tanks the British did, and he attacked anyway. 6 weeks later, his army stalled 60 miles from Alexandria, out of fuel, out of momentum, out of time. The tanks aren't moving because the British stopped them. They're not moving because the engines are dead, bone dry, sitting in the open desert, 60 miles from a city they were never going to reach. This is Erwin Rommel's army in July 1942, the most feared armored force in the desert. The general the British called unstoppable, frozen in place by something no enemy commander did to him. He did it to himself. If your father or grandfather served in this theater, or grew up on stories passed down from men who did, this is the moment military historians still argue over, not the battle that finally broke Rommel, but the 6 weeks of pure winning that quietly built the trap he walked into. Every mile of that advance looked like genius in real time. Every headline out of Berlin called it inevitable. But the man who stalls 60 miles from Alexandria isn't undone by a British tactic or a lucky shell. He's undone by a decision made 300 miles behind him, at the gates of a fortress he'd just taken, in the greatest single victory of his career. That's the decision we're breaking down today. The moment's success itself became the most dangerous thing on the battlefield. If you want to understand why every major turning point in history had a single decision that made it inevitable, subscribe. I break one down every week. Hit subscribe now before we go deep on this. February 1941. Germany sends a little-known general to prop up a collapsing Italian position in Libya, not to win North Africa, just to stop the bleeding. Erwin Rommel arrives with 2 divisions, a fraction of what the British already have sitting in Egypt, and a mandate that amounts to hold the line, don't lose Tripoli, don't embarrass Berlin any further. He doesn't hold it. He attacks it. Within weeks, he's pushed the British back hundreds of miles, and a reputation starts to form on both sides of the wire. The Desert Fox, the general who wins with less. The commander British soldiers are told not to duel one-on-one because it's bad for morale when he wins. That reputation isn't propaganda dressed up after the fact. It's earned in real time, battle after battle, through 1941 and into 1942, against armor counts that should have made every one of his attacks a court-martial offense if they'd failed. But here's the puzzle sitting underneath the myth. The part the highlight reels skip. Every one of those wins was purchased on a supply line stretched further than any staff college would approve. The tanks were never the real advantage. The British usually had more of them and better ones by mid-1942. The real advantage was Rommel's willingness to gamble on a supply chain that couldn't support what he was asking his army to do, and get away with it again and again because the British kept blinking first. A gambler who keeps winning stops recalculating the odds. He starts trusting the streak instead of the math. That is exactly the man walking into the Gazala line in the late spring of 1942, not a reckless amateur, a calculated risk-taker whose calculations had quietly stopped accounting for risk at all. The British commanders at Gazala had the numbers on paper and the confidence to match, nearly double Rommel's tank strength, dug into a defensive line they believed was unbreakable, backed by minefields running unbroken from the coast deep into the desert south. Rommel looked at that math and did the one thing no cautious general does. He attacked directly into it. On paper, it wasn't close. British armor outnumbered Rommel's panzers by nearly 2-to-1 at Gazala, dug into minefields and fortified boxes, built specifically to bleed an attacker white before it ever reached the coast road. Any textbook says you don't attack that math. Rommel attacked it anyway, swinging his armor around the open southern flank. Through desert, the British had judged impassable for a force his size, in a night march that put his tanks behind the entire Allied line by dawn. For 4 days it looked like a catastrophic gamble. His own supply columns got caught and surrounded inside a pocket. His own troops started calling the cauldron, trapped, low on fuel, taking fire from 3 directions at once. Most accounts stop there, at the tactical brilliance of the flanking move. They don't tell you what almost went wrong inside that pocket, or why it worked anyway. Most accounts of Gazala end with the flanking maneuver, a masterstroke, textbook armored warfare, the kind of move that gets taught at staff colleges to this day. But here's what no one calculated on the British side: Rommel's willingness to fight encircled rather than break out. punching temporary gaps through his own minefields under artillery fire to resupply the trapped force, betting his entire southern wing on holding ground that most generals would already have written off as lost. So why did he hold that ground instead of pulling back to safety while he still could? Because retreat, at this exact point in the campaign, wasn't in his working vocabulary anymore. Every previous gamble across the last 14 months had paid off, and the pattern was starting to look like a law of nature instead of a streak that could break. By early June, the British defensive boxes at Gazala begin falling one by one, and what was supposed to be an unbreakable line collapses in weeks instead of the months it was built to hold. The remnants of the 8th Army pull back toward a fortress they believe can hold, no matter what happens in the open desert around it. Tobruk. Rommel doesn't pause at the frontier to rest an army that has just fought 4 straight days encircled. He turns the whole force toward the walls. Worth pausing on the scale of this before moving forward. Rommel's entire Panzer Army Africa, at its peak in mid-1942, never fielded more tanks than a single well-supplied British armoured division would today. Every gamble described so far was fought over a stretch of desert wider than most European countries, using a fraction of the machinery either side actually wanted. That's not a footnote. It's the whole reason the fuel question is about to matter more than any tactic on the field. That fortress, Tobruk, had already humiliated Rommel once, holding out for 241 days in 1941 while his supply lines strangled around it, and his first African campaign stalled at its walls. This time he isn't going to lay siege at all. He's going to take it in a single morning. On June 20th, 1942, Rommel throws his entire concentrated force at Tobruk's defenses in one coordinated assault instead of the grinding, months-long siege that failed the year before. And by the next day, the garrison surrenders. 35,000 Allied prisoners taken in under 24 hours. More men than the entire force Rommel commanded when he arrived in Africa. The fortress that stopped him once falls faster than almost anyone on either side believed possible, and on the surface, it's the single greatest victory of his career. Hitler promotes him to field marshal on the spot by radio message, the youngest man in the German army ever to hold that rank. Church bells ring in some German towns, but the win and the danger arrive in the exact same breath. In the same set of documents, every fuel truck, every replacement tank, every artillery shell his army now runs on has to travel further than it did the day before Tobruk fell, deeper into Egypt. Further from the Libyan ports, his entire supply chain depends on, and the quartermasters, filing the after-action reports on captured fuel and remaining reserves already know the numbers don't support what Rommel is about to ask of them next. Tobruk falls in under a day. 35,000 prisoners. A field marshal's baton delivered by personal radio message from Hitler himself, making Rommel the youngest man in the German army to hold the rank. By every visible measure, June 21st, 1942 is the best day of Rommel's career, and the worst decision of his career gets made inside the celebration. His own logistics staff files reports the same week, showing fuel reserves already below what's needed to sustain another major push into Egypt. Rommel reads them. This is the part every retelling of the great victory at Tobruk leaves out entirely. This is the fork in the road nobody puts in the highlight reel. The fortress falls. The promotion arrives by radio within hours. And the fuel math that should have stopped everything gets quietly overruled in the same week it's written down. Most versions of this story treat Tobruk as the climax. It isn't. It's the exact point where the climax should have been the end of the offensive, not the start of a new one. So what does a general do with a written report telling him to stop at the height of the best winning streak of his career? Rommel doesn't file it for review. He doesn't slow down to rebuild the supply chain his own staff says he needs. He turns the army east toward a border his quartermasters explicitly told him not to cross yet. That overruled report is the real turning point of this entire campaign. Not a battle, not a beach, not a single dramatic order shouted across a command tent. A memo his own supply officers wrote in plain numbers, and he chose not to believe. His quartermasters told him to stop at the Egyptian border, rebuild the supply chain from Tobruk's captured stores and the ports behind him, and resume the offensive once fuel and replacement armor actually caught up with the front line. Every previous German staff assessment of this entire campaign had assumed exactly that kind of operational pause after a victory this size. Rommel overruled his own logistics command in writing and pushed on instead, chasing the retreating British roughly 240 miles in 6 days, because stopping now, with the British broken and running for Cairo, felt like the one mistake a general in his position could never afford to make. This is the chess moment no four-word thumbnail can fully compress. It isn't a battlefield error. It's a psychological one. Made at a desk with the numbers already in front of him, Rommel had spent 16 months proving that aggression beats caution in this exact theatre. Gazala proved it under nearly 2-to-1 odds. Tobruk proved it twice over in a single morning. So why would this pursuit be any different from the 10 gambles before it that all paid off? Because the math had finally caught up with the myth, and nobody in the command tent was positioned to say so to the man who'd just been made a field marshal. Every mile past the Egyptian border stretched his supply line past what any amount of tactical brilliance could equal, compensate for on the battlefield, and the exact instinct that built his legend. Across 2 years in the desert was now the instinct actively, hollowing out the army underneath him. By June 30th, his forces reached the Alamein line, 60 miles from Alexandria, the deepest Axis penetration into Egypt of the entire war, the closest any German force will ever get to the Nile. It is also, almost to the day, the moment the tanks start running on fumes instead of momentum. 60 miles from Alexandria, the pursuit that had covered nearly 250 miles in 6 days simply stops. And for the first time in the entire campaign, it isn't Rommel choosing where his own army halts. By July 1st, 1942, the panic behind the British lines is already real. In Cairo, rear area units and the British embassy begin burning classified documents in such volume that half-charred paper drifts down over the city streets, a day Cairo will remember afterward as ash. Wednesday, the Royal Navy pulls its Mediterranean fleet out of Alexandria harbour. Some Italian residents put out flags to welcome the army they assume is coming within days. Rommel himself, up at the front with his lead units, jokes to one of his officers that tomorrow they'll be drinking coffee together in Cairo. Nobody on either side of the wire believes, on July 1st, that the war in Egypt is about to stop moving, but it does. General Claude Auchinleck, commanding the reformed British Eighth Army, doesn't need a masterstroke to win the first battle of Alamein. He needs patience, because Rommel's army, the same one that took Tobruk in a single morning 11 days earlier, is now attacking a fixed defensive line with tanks that are one missing fuel convoy away from immobile. The gambit that won at Gazala, swing wide, hit the open flank, force the enemy to react before they can set their own trap, depends entirely on mobility. Mobility depends on fuel, and the fuel isn't coming because it's still sitting in ports back in Libya, physically unable to reach a front line that has outrun its own supply chain by roughly 300 miles in under 2 weeks. The attacks that follow through the first 3 days of July are increasingly desperate and increasingly costly, not because British resistance suddenly improved overnight, but because Rommel is now fighting the exact overextension his own quartermasters warned him about in writing less than 3 weeks earlier. By mid-July, the offensive that began with a general willing to attack against nearly 2-to-1 odds ends with that same general, unable to push another mile past a coastal railway station nobody outside Egypt had ever heard of, not defeated outright in the field, but strategically checkmated by his own momentum running out ahead of his supply lines. Auchinleck is relieved of command within weeks, credited with little at the time despite holding the line that mattered most. But the position he holds at Alamein is the position Rommel never breaks again. And 3 months later, a new commander named Bernard Montgomery will attack an Axis force that has never fully rebuilt the fuel reserves it burned through chasing the British to this exact spot, turning a stalled advance into a full retreat that doesn't stop until Tunisia, over 1,000 miles to the west. Here is the part the brilliant tactician version of this story leaves out entirely. The instinct that made Rommel a legend across 1941 and the instinct that destroyed his army in Egypt in 1942 were the exact same instinct, applied one campaign too many times without being recalculated. Every gamble that worked the flanking move at Gazala against nearly double his own tank strength, the single morning assault that took Tobruk after it had held out for 241 days the year before, trained him to believe that hesitation, not overextension, was the only real danger on this battlefield. That belief was correct, provably, for roughly 16 months. It stopped being correct the exact moment his supply lines ran out of road before his ambition did, and nobody close enough to him was willing to say so out loud, with the field marshal's baton still fresh in his hand. Rommel didn't lose North Africa to a smarter general standing across from him at Alamein. He lost it to a version of himself, 3 weeks and 1 victory earlier, that had forgotten how to read a report telling him to stop. If you want to go deeper, the next breakdown is right there. And if you found this useful, subscribe before you leave. 1 video every week. See you on the next move.